Everybody see that?
I can see it on my screen.
You've got it.
Okay, awesome. Rich, thank you for sacrificing your computer. All right, I'm going to go to view slideshow. There we go. Okay, so basically the title of this exhibition is Nature in the Abstract. And it consists of 3 divisions of entries. One of them being Nature in the Abstract, which is images that are pretty much what one sees, like what you're looking at here on this screen, but nature that's made its own abstract patterns. And the next one is called essentially abstractions of nature, which basically means that the artist has the freedom to make their own vision of nature as an abstract object, as opposed to a photograph or a painting that actually shows in the details of something that's in existence. And then we also have a youth category. And altogether, this exhibition includes about, well, a little over 100 works that are from people in California, Idaho, Washington, and Oregon, pretty much. So it was a lot of fun to hang, and it was a really, I think it's a really lovely exhibit. And what I want to do today is kind of talk a little bit about why do an exhibit about nature in the abstract. First of all, I'm a geologist. And so one might wonder why a scientist would want to do, in particular, abstractions of things. And part of the reason for that is kind of personal history, in that I had a free art education for the first 18 years of my life. Both of my parents were artists. And so every time we went for a walk in the woods, or every time we drove somewhere, or every time I did the dishes for that matter, there was always something artistic to talk about. There was compositions, there were colors, there were ways things blended together to make a composition. And so not only did I, have an interest in rocks, but that interest in rocks really came from the aesthetics. So for example, I would go for a walk in particular with my mother, who would be looking at this kind of a rock and would be puzzling out the reason for these patterns and how to interpret them. And, she would be looking at this and thinking about maybe it was a petrified snake, or maybe it was a lightning bolt, or maybe it was something else. And then would be talking about the art and the forms and the composition and the colors. You can see over in this part of the image, there's some little garnets that are sort of red. This is, I now know, what's called a tigmatic vein, and it in particular tells you something about the kind of stress and the temperatures that were there. And so in time, I began to learn that not only were these interesting compositions, and not only were these often really, beautiful colors and objects, but that not only could I make up my own story about this, but I could also tell the story of the rock. I could also tell the story of the earth by looking at what seemed to be patterns that made really very little sense. And I think we find that sort of throughout science. So for example, these, now with the trees that give you kind of a scale, are what are called crossbeds in the Navajo sandstone in Utah. And this is a Jurassic formation. It basically was during the times of the dinosaurs, not T-Rex, but Allosaurus, which was the Jurassic equivalent of T-Rex. And so these big dinosaurs would have been wandering across what we can tell from this really wonderful cross-bedded pattern here, were really gigantic windblown sand dunes. And so I've kind of gotten ahead of myself here, but when we think about how do we tell what things are, how do we recognize things, I can recognize this as sand dunes, because if we look at modern sand dunes, we see the same patterns, but we can also use the pattern and analyze it, for that matter, at the particle size, the slope of these dunes, to determine the direction of a wind 180 million years ago. And we can use that pattern to also determine the velocity of the wind, and use the little pieces, parts that make that up, to tell where the winds specifically were coming from. So it's a beautiful abstract pattern, but like so many things that we think of as being abstract, it's not truly abstract. And we can use these patterns to tell stories that are our own original ideas of what this is, or we can use these stories, these patterns, to really delve into what and how these patterns were made, and tell the story of the earth, or tell the story of a plant, or tell the story of a microorganism. So when we think about how we recognize anything, I'll bet most of you can tell what kind of a bird this is, right? It's a magpie. But how do we tell it's a magpie? Well, partly because it's looking at us kind of like, well, who are you to look at me and take my picture? But largely because of its patterns, its long tail, the patterns of the color, the patterns of the wings, the pattern of the black cape. And so when we think about things, when we're looking at a door, or we're looking at a car, and we want to know what kind of a car it is, we use patterns that actually are often kind of abstract patterns, especially as we look at either more modern cars or very old cars, to decipher what it is that we're looking at. So again, this is something that would be considered just abstract patterns in many cases. But when our brain puts these abstractions of form together, okay, we're all looking at a ponderosa pine. And so there's a utility in looking at and understanding abstractions, not only from the viewpoint of telling our own story about them, or just admiring the patterns and the way the lines come together, and how this line blends into another line, and this takes our eye somewhere else, but also to just basically gain information about the world around us. So that's one reason that I was really interested in patterns. This is so let me back up. I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, so when we're looking at the thing that generated my interest in trying to do a show about abstractions and abstractions in nature and abstract art, the thing that really drove me to do this was this image, which looks like it would hang in the Metropolitan or the Museum of Modern Art. But in actuality, it's a NASA JPL Caltech photograph of chaotic clouds on Jupiter. So it's a real thing. And so not only does this spark our imagination, not only do we begin to look at this kind of like clouds in the sky, and we see, I don't know, an Art Deco scorpion over here, or maybe an elephant, a modified elephant, or a T-Rex over here. But we can also, if we're a scientist, use these patterns to deduce the velocity of wind, the composition of the atmosphere. And so abstract art and looking at what seem to be abstractions in nature can be a lot more than just looking at a pleasing pattern or an intriguing pattern. And I think when we're artists, particularly when we're not photographers, when we're painters, or we're ceramicists, or we're making things out of wood, we tend to make patterns that tell stories of some sort. So this was another one that I was looking at, and it's cloud turbulence on Jupiter. It's another JPL Caltech image. but it would deservedly, I think, hang in the gallery that we have here today in the Josephy Center. And so when we look at some of the art that is hanging here, this is Monica Eng's ceramic piece called Imagination. We can look at this and think of a number of things, all the way from galaxies to microorganisms. But it, or just look at a pleasing pattern. But it does have some similarities to patterns that we see in nature. This isn't Jupiter. This is actually a Landsat photograph of phytoplanktonic bloom in the Baltic Sea. So these abstract images in and abstract patterns in science, as well as in art, really there's kind of a nexus, a confluence between those that I think is really fascinating, and that really leads me to spend a lot of time looking at abstractions, whether they're abstractions that are photographs of other planets, photographs of this planet, or an oil painting or a watercolor that someone has done. This is an abstraction of sorts, but it's a Landsat false color photograph of the New South Wales shoreline in Australia. And again, this is another piece that I think we could easily have hanging in our exhibit, because it certainly doesn't, when you look at it, doesn't look much like a Landsat image of anything. But this is true of many things. And it's also true that we can look at abstractions on many, many scales. There's a great competition every year that's sponsored by Nikon that's called Small World. And it's based, what they use is photomicrographs, or microscopic photography. And the winners, I thought of putting some in, but I decided I'd use our own art instead. But basically, this is an art form that melds usually biology, sometimes mineralogy, with what you see through a microscope, which is its own little cosmos. So we can go all the way from Jupiter, or look at Hubble telescope photographs, to looking at our own planet, to looking at things that are much closer and much tinier, like microorganisms. This is the Flinders Range in Australia from the space shuttle. Doesn't really look like a mountain range, but somebody in the space shuttle had quite an eye for the abstract. Now, when you kind of compare these two, the colors are sort of the same, but this is Rick McEwen's extraordinary photograph called Window Ice. And it's kind of more on the microscopic scale than looking at a landscape photo of the Flinders Range. But nevertheless, it's an abstraction. When I first saw this, I wasn't sure whether it was feathers or whether it was ice or what it was. But when you look at the composition, it's truly an excellent composition. So I'd encourage everybody to come down and see these images for themselves. This is Rick's first prize Nature in the Abstract winning image called The Illusion of Permanence. And Rick, you're online. Is there anything you'd like to add about those two images?
No, well, the first one that you showed was a window. It was my car window.
Uh-huh.
The colors were things that were inside the car.
Right.
So, and this one is was in Galapagos. It was a lava flow, ropey lava. And I took a lot of shots, and I liked this one. It looked like it was actually something that was alive, growing like a tree, like coming out of a seed.
Yeah, it's really extraordinary, and it does look very much like it's alive, and it gives one the feeling of of growth and flow that was captured as this lava flow basically came to rest. And as a geologist, I can look at this and I can also get information about the temperature of the flow and the slope that it was flowing across by looking at the lava's composition and then correlating that with the size of the ropey pahoehoe sort of fingers or limbs that come out there. So there's a meaning more than the pattern there if you're a scientist, but that doesn't mean that I can't, marvel at the composition that Rick has captured here. Thanks, Rick. This is Marlon Green's interpretation of a lava flow that also somehow captures the idea of flow and temperature gradients. I mean, to me, it's mostly a painting that looks at flow and movement and, perhaps heat. But again, we all have our interpretation when it comes to abstract art. And that's one of to me, the most fun things about abstractions is that you can let your imagination just run with things. This is columnar jointing in the Columbia River Gorge. And it's basically the melding or the place where two different rates of cooling in the same lava flow come together. The top here is basically called an entablature, and this is where the lava is cooling from the top down. And it's cooling fast enough so it can't make big columns. And it's also cooling fast enough so it's oftentimes not really very straight. Whereas the bottom part, the colonnade, is cooling from the ground up. And so it's kept warmer, its columns are bigger. And where there's this junction here is never a smooth surface, but it is very telling in terms of, again, composition of the lava flow. So again, it's abstract patterns, but abstract patterns that sort of have a purpose. And then these are abstract patterns in Nesquin Rocks, Susan Schomburg's composition. So I'm glad to see that there were a lot of people who actually did utilize geology and geologic things. This is on Steams Mountain, and it's what we call a turkey track basalt or turkey track texture. If I were going to overwhelm you with Latin-based words, it would be glomera porphyritic, but that won't be on the quiz after the show. So you can find abstractions, as I said, on any scale, whether it's in geology or biology or physics, whether it's in our own lives. And taking the time to actually sit and look at these objects in nature and kind of go into the depth of their compositions is something that's a real fun thing to do if you're sitting on a rock somewhere. And this is a photomicrograph of a basalt with a big crystal here of a mineral called pyroxene and then other stuff around it. So it's kind of an abstraction. It's hard to tell exactly what this is unless you're the person that collected the rock. To a geologist, it's very telling. To the rest of us, it's I hope, sort of imaginative. Okay, this is a pillow basalt on Mary's Peak. Again, you can make all kinds of things out of this. You could make it a primitive head, Easter Island kind of a sculpture. To a geologist, okay, I love pillow lavas because they're all unique. They have different ways of fitting together. They tell the story of a lava that was erupted at very high temperatures underwater. So you can imagine steam bursting forth from this eruption. The outside rim here, this particular pillow lava is about 60 million years old, and it's still got some glass around the outside where the lava interacted with the water, and the lava chilled so fast that it had no time to crystallize. And so it has this really wonderful glassy rim that's this sort of dark black material. And then instead of having columnar jointing, Rich, your computer keeps getting ahead of me. You have these radial joints that go into the rock and just make a compelling pattern. This is spheroidal weathering in basalts. But again, you can make an alien face out of this, or you can look at it and take it apart little bit by little bit to understand the chemistry of weathering. So this was probably at one point a joint that came down here and allowed water to come into this basalt. This is up by Madras. And as that water percolated through the basalt, it actually began to interact with the basalt and created these round zones where the basalt was being transformed into more of a clay. So again, there's a mechanism for this, but to me, the pattern is really interesting. This is a series of what we call concretions, that is collections of material actually transported by groundwater in the sandstone in Kentucky. And this is basically concretions and cracks in the Astoria mudstone, which produced a whole different kind of a weathering pattern, but you still have the more solid rock in the center and then these triangular pieces around the outside. And then we have, beyond weathering, we have places where deformation has taken over and scrunched rocks into what I think are enthralling patterns. This is what's called a ribbon shirt at a place called Rainbow Rock in Bandon, Oregon, and it's basically on the coast. And this is actually a sea cave that let in some fairly astounding light, and also had the weathered rock had some pretty astounding colors in it as well. So it's, when rocks or really anything else in nature is seldom just a rock. If you look at it and think about it enough and sort of spend some time with things, you'll find these, that nature is really quite the artist, and nature has its own ideas of how to abstract things. So this is about a 240 million year old seafloor sediment that was squashed against North America, and hence its pattern of folding there, which again is interesting. And I could wander through this little sea cave for hours just looking at the patterns. This is a 2 billion year old gneiss from the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Again, a series of abstractions to geologists. They give us ideas of temperature and pressure. What happens to us under pressure? Sometimes I think I feel a lot like this during COVID and during the current political framework that we're all living in. But it's still an abstract pattern that has been wrought by natural forces, and fun to think about as its own pattern, but also fun to think about as what it tells us. So this one is at Newberry Crater, and a obsidian flow where you have the forces of flow. You can see this obsidian is a very, very viscous, gooey, slow-moving lava. And this has managed to actually tear apart a piece in the center that was already solidified. So you can see this piece would ultimately, you could flip it over and fit it up into here. So this sort of bespeaks the power of these flows. It gives us an idea of the viscosity of the what will become a glass flowing on the outside. But it also is a kind of, to my mind, a very thought-provoking pattern. Whether you know about the fact that it's a solid chunk of obsidian that's torn off of one piece and floated somewhere else, or whether you just look at it as a pattern. And one thing that I'll also mention is that, you know, Rich Wanschneider has been putting together a project to look at Native American, in particular, Nez Perce stories of places. And these are places that have, in particular, a geologic importance to the Nez Perce, or an importance to the Nez Perce and also a geologic importance. And almost inevitably, as I've worked with Rich a bit on the project, what we find is that you don't have to have a mass spectrometer or an ion probe or a Landsat satellite to look at patterns and think about what caused them and what forces were involved and how things were made. Because Nez Perce stories of place that, for example, Heart of the Monster, or some of the other things like where there are red stripes in Hell's Canyon. There are people who've lived with this landscape for a very long time, at the minimum 16,500 years, and in what would be called time immemorial, that is, time without memory. But those stories almost always have a scientific, what we would look at today and recognize as a scientific insight, as something that is scientifically true, that's at the heart of how this thing formed. So you don't, as I said, you don't need an ion probe or a mass spectrometer to figure these things out. And so sitting down, looking at something like this, and making up your own story about maybe how it formed, or maybe just what it means, is a valid and often valuable thing to do. This is the Moab Fault in Utah. So again, you can find these patterns in nature in just all kinds of different places and all kinds of different scales. I like to photograph these things with no scale, which drives other geologists nuts, because usually you'll find a picture, you know, a ruler included here somewhere. So you know that this is actually about a meter in size, and that's important if you're doing the science part. But to me, oftentimes it's the composition and just looking at this and thinking about how did this happen that's a more important thing to do. So our exhibitors, our participants, and the artists that we have here often have similar visions. So this is Leslie Ann Hauer's rock form cracks. Leslie has 3 paintings here that really depict geologic forces, the art that's within rocks and that's within nature itself. And I think that it's an interesting, it's a little bit of a departure from that interpretation, but nevertheless, it gets the same idea across of force and separation. This is in the Morrison Formation in Utah. Again, in basically a sort of a slot canyon spot. But you can see that things that used to be together are being rent apart. I just kind of, so you patterns all over the place. Sand ripples and dunes in Escalante, Utah. And if everyone's probably noticed, my internet connection is unstable. Janice Carper, Rock of Desperation. There's no scale here. So you don't know whether Janice is talking about a hand-sized pebble, a thin section, or whether it's an emotional landscape, which I'm sure it is. But again, it bespeaks the colors of the earth, the patterns of the earth. William Burkett's Water, which won an honorable mention in Abstractions of Nature. Marlon Green, Softness of the Sea. They all basically, this certainly invokes flow and a lot of other emotions. But if you think back to the swirling clouds of Jupiter, there's some similarity there too. Okay, Craig Pesty Strobel's Dance of Life, which shows sockeye or kokanee moving up through the water. Going back to geology, columnar joints at Warm Springs. And then we have Mackenzie's The Salt, which won second place in the Youth Award. Again, just abstracting those patterns into something that was more familiar to him and more, maybe more malleable mentally. Jennifer Hawkins Conley Hurricane, where she's taken the patterns that we see for anyone who's walked up Hurricane Creek. Okay, this is a familiar sight, but instead of doing a detailed painting or a photograph, we have the patterns of nature here. So you can kind of think about the browns and the greens and how all of that blends together to make a landscape. Okay, and finally, this is My Mountain, which won first place in the youth category as a felted piece. I think it's a really thought-provoking piece, and so did our judge, Susan. So with that, I'm going to leave you to go wandering off on your own and sort of marvel at the patterns that you can find in nature. In this case, it's a rhyolite in Central Oregon, and Dundee is trying to figure out whether or not there are any mice in the holes, I think. But, you know, it's all open to our own interpretation. Keep in mind that at least to geologists, all those abstractions and all those patterns have double meaning in their, both in the patterns that invoke imagination and the patterns that invoke story, so that we can understand what it is that we're looking at even better. So with that, I will quit and let you guys get on with whatever else you have planned for the day. Thank you.
Well, why don't you take
Yeah.
a couple of questions?
Oh,
Or-
questions. Okay. Sure.
Do we have any questions? You can enter them in the chat box. Or just unmute your microphone and yell it out.
Okay, I think I've been.
No, got it covered.
Yeah,
Okay, well, thanks, Ellen.
yeah, you're
That was
welcome.
informative.
Okay,
Very inspiring.
okay.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Okay.
We should have had.
Okay, I think we got it.
Is that it? Hi, Elnora. There it is, like right in the back there.
Here.
Pillars of the Fire.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thought I had-
Thank you.
Book on Thursday, folks, at noon. Colors of the Flower Moon.
Say what, Rich?
Our book group is talking about Killers of the Flower Moon on Thursday at noon.
Great. See ya.
Propane.
See you there.
You didn't miss very much because, oh, you're still unmuted.